This is Internet Marketing.
Hello and welcome to the Internet Marketing Podcast brought to you by Site Visibility. With me today is Paul Spirou, Managing Director at Ape Creative. And we're going to be talking about all things challenger brand thinking. So I think the title I'm going to go for is What is Challenger Brand Thinking? And that comes from my personal curiosity because I've never heard that phrase before. And when I was talking to Paul about this episode and what he can bring to our listeners today, this terminology came up. And I've explored a similar topic with one of my colleagues, Rachel Pearson, on the podcast, maybe 10, 15 episodes ago when we were talking about brand affinity marketing, which I assume is going to be similar to challenger brand thinking. But I'm keen to explore whether I'm correct in that assumption and also to understand more about what challenger brand thinking is. So welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Thanks.
No problem. And would you mind just taking a moment to introduce yourself and Ape Creative to our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ape is a creative agency that essentially does three things. We create brands, we develop existing brands, and we help activate either of those eventualities. Mostly our history and expertise is in food and beverage, or in the food and beverage sector. And but over the last couple of years, we've started to work a little bit more with professional service firms who particularly are in competitive markets where brand differentiation is hard to come by. All of the work we do is essentially underpinned by this idea of challenger brands and challenger brand thinking, because we think that creates better brands and better businesses that can have more impact on the world that they inhabit, but they can also have more fulfilled and engaged people and teams, and they can potentially grow faster too.
So that begs the question, as I posed at the beginning there. So what is challenger brand thinking? How would you define what it is, and where does that terminology come from?
Okay, so it's the term challenger was originally coined by a chap called Adam Morgan in a book that he wrote back in 2009 called Eating the Big Fish. And he did a study on successful startups and how they'd grown fast and gone from niche players to becoming number ones or really strong number twos. And in that analysis, he unearthed a sort of a series of common traits. And then those traits then became an approach and shaped an approach that others could follow. It's not quite a blueprint, but if you understand and commit to the thinking, it can be something that's successfully applied to all kinds of different situations around branding and marketing. And that's probably a good point to clarify some of the labels that get thrown around, because there's lots of terminology in this area. People talk about challengers, people talk about disruptors, people talk about brand purpose, and they're all terms that get used to describe businesses that are taking different approaches to those that we traditionally expect. But in actual fact, this approach, and I think this thinking, is becoming increasingly common. I suspect it will become the norm. So just to sort of unpack those three things a little bit. So challenger typically refers to businesses with a strong brand belief. So they use that belief to guide everything that they do. And the brands are built or developed and activated around that deeply held belief, as opposed to the conventional approach, which would be to lead on messages about product or service features and benefits. That's the conventional way of marketing and selling. But the challengers think that if you lead on a belief and push to create some fame around it, businesses have the opportunity to change the competitive narrative, and they can occupy territory that their competitors can't easily move into. So you have some ownable space, and in competitive markets, that's powerful stuff. That's the gold dust. So just to give that some context, there's a couple of, I'll pick out a couple of powerful and current examples. So one is a confectionery brand called Tony's Chocolonely, and the other is a toilet brand called Who Gives a Crap. And both have recently, in the last few years, have become super successful. So Tony's, they make really lovely chocolate bars, brilliant flavours, but with a single-minded focus to make all chocolate 100% slave-free. But in one fell swoop, they tell us that there's a modern-day slave trade in one of our favourite treats. I mean, who knew that was even a thing? They also tell us that they're crazy about chocolate and serious about people. And the brand really emphasises the unevenness in the chocolate industry. And they do that in a number of ways around the brand. But the unevenness is from manufacture through the supply chain and into retail. And where the bulk of the money goes, and it's no great surprise to hear that a very, very small proportion of that goes to the farmers. So Tony's have a belief and an agenda that that's something that needs addressing. Who gives a crap? Sell toilet paper that helps provide clean toilets for people who need them. Now they donate 50% of their profits to help build toilets because they believe that access to a safe, dignified loo is a basic human right. And of course it is, but we just take those things for granted and think that that's a given anywhere in the world. And of course it's not. And in the last year, they've grown so fast that approach has enabled them to donate over £3.2 million to that particular cause. But they're not, they're not about philanthropy or benevolence in their communication. Of course they are in what they do, but their marketing and their brand is delivered with irreverence and a smile and actually a nice design around the loo roll wrapper that means that you'll happily leave it on the shelf in the bathroom for people to see in a way that you wouldn't leave a roll of Andrex or one of the others because it's got the nasty sort of plastic film around it. But a challenger isn't always about philanthropy or giving, and there's some other interesting examples. One of which people might have come across is Lemonade. They're an insurance business, and their model is based on transparency. And they're very clear about all the money they get in, all the money that goes out, what their share is, and what their share of it is, and what they do with what's left over. And it's built on the principle that they say that we as consumers believe that it's okay to defraud our insurers a little bit. And, I have some empathy with that and some understanding of that. Whoever's made an insurance claim and, who hasn't made an insurance claim and thought, well, yeah, I'll just stick that bill on it as well and see if I can get away with something else. It's something that people do quite commonly, I think. But Lemonade have gone to the market and said, everybody thinks that's okay because everybody thinks they're getting overcharged by the insurers. You feel like you're being screwed by your insurers, so you'll kind of, squeeze them back a little bit. So they get rid of all of that with a sense of transparency. Lime is another insurance business, but this time in healthcare, and they're doing a similar approach, but theirs is more purpose-driven. They talk about democratizing healthcare and making affordable healthcare available for the many, not the few, because private medical insurance and healthcare insurance is invariably expensive. But what Lime are doing is deconstructing those policies into their constituent parts so that you can buy the bits that you need for £7, £8, £10 a chunk, as it were. And so that, that's an example of challengers that, they set out a belief and they build their brand around that belief. Disruptor was one of the other terms I mentioned earlier on, and that typically refers to those businesses that come into a market with a new technology that potentially changes the game. So if you think about what Uber did for getting around and what they call ride sharing, they use technology in our hands and in our phones to be able to access that level of transport and transparency very, very easily. Airbnb did a similar thing for holidays. Monzo and Starling did a similar thing for banking. It's all about using technology to change the way that we connect and communicate with those particular brands and services. And they've all used that tech in a way that the incumbents or the market leaders, they could never have dreamed of because they've built these sort of monolithic businesses and environments and they never needed to change anything. But now they're all chasing hard to catch up because that disruptor technology and approach has really captured our attention as consumers and shoppers and buyers. And so it's become the new norm. The difference is that the previous market leaders, the reason they've succeeded is that by being a market leader, they build up a gravitational force and they kind of just drag everybody along with them. So they're not about to fall drastically or fail, but they are having to change fast to maintain their relevance for the next 20 odd years. But what disruptors show us is that in any given market, there's always room to take on the market leader. And the last of those 3 points is about purpose. And purpose tends to refer to businesses that are helping tackle a societal or a global issue. And there's often a much clearer, overt statement of intent in that area. And it's kind of simply put by Colin Mayer in his book, Prosperity. when he says, businesses need to find profitable solutions to the problems of the people and the planet, not to profit from those problems. And I think that really captures it really, really neatly. There's often been this tension between business and purpose. But I think the way that Colin Mayer frames it is you need to find a profitable solution to a problem. And then that way you find comfortable territory between purpose and profit. It's okay to have a business that's underpinned by by purpose and make a profit at the same time. That's a perfectly acceptable ambition.
Mm.
So, as we talked about already, challenges often have an element of purpose about them. Tony's and Who Gives a Crap are good examples. But also businesses like Unilever, a huge brand-owning business, they place a lot of emphasis on this too. And I even noticed Colgate, probably the world's biggest toothpaste brand, promoting their purpose agenda around improving oral healthcare globally. And that was just on some of those big cardboard units in Sainsbury's recently. But I think the important point is that when businesses that have a global reach take on an ambition that can have a huge impact, it doesn't matter what the terminology around it is. That's got to be a good thing. So regardless of the term used, more businesses that are totally committed to something more than profits or returning shareholder value, it has got to be positive for all of us. And the last thing I'd say is that with any of those three terms, whether it's challenger, whether it's disruptor, whether it's about purpose, they're often retrospectively applied by watchers or commentators as nouns, and they're used to label a business. But actually the reality is a whole lot of work and thinking that gets done under the surface to enable that situation to manifest itself. So at Ape, we like to think of those labels really as verbs. It's a way of describing an approach that helps establish the thinking and the brand belief so that we can embed it into the business and to activate it and help build fame around it.
There's so many interesting points from what you shared there. So thanks for going through that so thoroughly. Some thoughts that come to mind immediately for me. I'm sure our listeners are going to get sick of this on the podcast because I've referenced this a few times, but maybe at this point, maybe 15, 20 episodes ago, I recorded a podcast with a UK-based company called Imagine, and they are a network of Generation Z consultants. And one of the points that came up in that podcast was that Generation Z, Generation Z, they're looking for these deeply held beliefs to make them feel part of a brand. And really, they look for that. They need that in order to become brand advocates. And so it's important for the generation that's coming up. So that stands out to me. And the second thing, in marketing, we're all familiar with the phrases USPs, and that's been our starting point when looking at product differentiation or service differentiation for a long time. But what you're talking about is really no longer a unique selling point. It's more a uniquely held belief that can help differentiate you and brings more to the table for your brand. Does that sound fair as a summary of that last point?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, go back to the point about Gen Z and the sort of the affinity with authenticity. I think we, as consumers, our perspectives have evolved, and the speed with which we can communicate with one another means that we can sniff out the disingenuous and the BS, if I can put it that way, really, really quickly. And I think we've really rallied against the idea of being sold to in that conventional way. So we want to align with brands that share the same belief, that stand for the same principles that we do. And it doesn't have to be always have to be deep and meaningful. It might be about local sourcing or employing local people, or the crafted technique with the way that the goods or the service is delivered. But it has to be something more than the slightly inauthentic features and benefits that just become I think, as you said, indistinct, which kind of leads nicely on to the second point about USPs and differentiation. It is so difficult now every market is super, super competitive. It's almost impossible to have a USP unless you have truly invented something totally new. It's very, very difficult to maintain that. One, it's very difficult to do. And secondly, it's very, very difficult to maintain it because the speed of change is so fast. So if we pin our colours to a particular mast and a particular belief that's authentic and ownable, it is ours, and it is difficult for other people to emulate. And it's not to say that you pin your colours to a particular mast forever and a day, because challengers, disruptors, and purpose-led brands are super relevant to what's happening in the world that they inhabit in that moment. And sometimes it extends for years, but it's an evolving situation because the nature of businesses and competitive markets that we sit in evolves. We can't keep banging the same drum forever, but the drum that we do bang has got to be relevant to what we believe and what we believe our customers believe too.
So I'm going to coin the term on this podcast. You heard it here first. We're going to move from USPs to UHBs, uniquely held beliefs. That's what we're going for. That's what we're aiming for. And it's a nice transition onto. So I understand, and some of those companies that you referenced are fairly new companies, or at least they're more prominent now than they've ever been. But I'm really interested in companies that are perhaps in the position where the company perhaps has been around a long time, they're well established, but they're now moving into this new era where uniquely held beliefs are so important to marketing, but perhaps they don't have them. And you actually touched on it as you were talking. You were saying it's very easy to sniff out. It's very easy to see when brands are trying to tap into that an emotional side of what is the new age of marketing, but doing it in a way that's insincere. So my question is, how do you think businesses that are well established, that perhaps don't have these uniquely held beliefs yet, can transition or pivot and do great marketing in this current era?
So I think the powerful thing here is that it's hard to be truly better than all of the alternatives to what your business offers, because there are so many alternatives. But it is possible to be different. And I think the way to do that is that businesses launching into or trying to grow in competitive sectors can start by looking at their competitors or the most common alternatives for what they offer. And not all marketing will say this, but put yourself in the shoes of your customer or your potential buyer and critique what the competitor brands say and what they stand for. And is it really that different to what you think and what you say? And is it immediately different in the eyes of the consumer? If what you say isn't that different, how could you develop it so that it is? Another way of approaching it is to think about the conventions in the sector. What does almost everybody in your market say and do? There will always be those kind of repeat patterns and the conventions with either the language or the images or the detail of the offer or the way that it's displayed to the customer on a shelf or on a web page. And it can be a bit of a sort of a daft but revealing exercise. But if you list out those conventions and then highlight and then note down, what would it be like if we did the absolute opposite of that? And in doing so, you can find some fertile territory. Clearly, you find things where it would be ludicrous for you to be to take the opposite stance or behave in the opposite way to the rest of the market or the competitors. But there's some fertile territory and some points come out that often raise eyebrows, and you think we should dive a little bit deeper into that. It's a challenging approach, and as I say, doubtless there's some kind of absurdities that come out in there, but there'll be some interesting ideas in there too. And when you land on those ideas that feel distinctive and fertile and resonate with you and the business, that's the opportunity to dig in a bit deeper. And I think the other point about exploring this kind of new way of thinking is not to worry about pleasing everybody all the time. we often find ourselves trying to pitch brands and messages and campaigns to quite wide and diverse audiences because businesses don't want to miss out on a potential commercial opportunity. But I think by doing so, you can often find yourself in the mush in the middle. You can't appeal to everybody all the time. And you have to think about who you're talking to know what you're truly going to say to them. So, and successful challengers don't worry too much about pleasing everybody. By being committed, the idea is that you speak specifically to a particular customer group and you attract more of those people to you, whether they're customers, whether they're colleagues, whether they're other stakeholders, or just whether they're fans of the brand.
It leads me to another interesting point, which is something I think about when I think about this concept that you're talking about today and that I've kind of broadly been introduced and are conscious of in marketing right now. And that's whether or not this level of thinking, whether or not these uniquely held beliefs and this commitment has to come from the top down. So does this vision have to come from a CEO, from an owner, from a managing director in order for it to translate and kind of revolutionize a company? Is that how you see it working? The one that comes to mind that you've spoken about actually is Tony's Chocolonely, who, from what I'm aware, the owner is she's at the forefront of their marketing.
Yeah, I think you often find that challenges on those kinds of brands in the early days are often led by ambitious and inspirational leaders, and they build and mold the business in their own image. And certainly, that kind of thinking is part of the foundation of that business. And in that case, it's almost certainly top down. But of course, as you mentioned, businesses are at various stages of their commercial life cycle, and there's opportunities to pivot and change directions at different times. So, I mean, the straight answer is no. It doesn't always have to be top down, but I think it's about applying the thinking in that way, and instead of it just being top down, consider voices from different parts of the business. Organizations always have their own particular voice, and that's made up of many components, and that should be part of what builds the nature of the brand. Otherwise, the danger is just people in marketing sitting around with people like me from agencies trying to set an agenda for others to follow, and that might not be the best way. But when the direction of a travel is agreed by those different voices in and around the business, it absolutely needs commitment and support from leadership, as well as dedicated champions or owners in other areas of the business too. So it doesn't need to be top down. It often is, because that's the nature of some of those businesses in their early phases. And if you were going to sort of retrospectively apply some of this thinking through a pivot or a change in direction, it has to be equally as rich and authentic for it to be true and ownable. And that will come by considering the perspectives and the voices of people within the business. And as I say, really embedding it in the business and making sure it has the support from the upper echelons and the senior leadership teams.
Yeah, I mean, it touches on a lot of other points that are socially relevant now in terms of diversity and inclusivity, because like you said, it can come top down, but it's also just listening to the voices around you and being conscious of what's happening around you and what your employees can bring to the table in terms of revolutionizing your brand and their uniquely held beliefs can make a brand itself, and often does make a brand. So like you said, it can take one person to have a vision, but then you need a consensus from your team to follow through with that vision and execute and really make a difference to whatever market you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you have a ready-made fan base of influencers and supporters that truly believe in the mission, who are going to go out and articulate it, honestly, truthfully, and authentically on the business's behalf.
So speaking practically for a moment, maybe you can bring this to life for me in terms of a fly on the wall at Ape Creative. How do you prospects come to you for design and marketing support? Can you talk me through the process of how you surface perhaps and how you highlight their uniquely held beliefs, their thinking, their challenger brand? How do you go about that process?
Yeah, absolutely. We focus on really starting a diagnostic process to understand and involve the key pillars of the brand and the business. And we do that by surfacing 6 key elements. The first one is about ambition. So we explore what the ambition for the brand or the business or this particular project is. And we tend to think about a 3-year horizon because it's far enough away to be stretching, but it's close enough to be achievable. And it works as a period. And there'll be an element of financial attainment in that ambition. But there's also, we try to make sure there's some more interesting elements to it in terms of the space that the brand would occupy, the impact that it's trying to have, and any other key measurables for the brand or for the business. The second point is about being clear on any big issues that might be hiding just around the corner to torpedo that ambition. And, we tend to find that they will land in probably 3 different areas. The issue is either a competitor issue where a competitor business or brand is about to launch with something that might impact our ability to achieve our ambition. It might be something to do with customers, or often it's something to do with internal stakeholders and the commitment or resource or a capability internally to achieve the ambition. The third point, it's a really important one, I think, and it's one that can be difficult to achieve, is to really understand who our customer is and not do that by demographics, because I think that's very much old news. We need to understand what motivates our customers and profile them, by the way that they behave and the things that they do. And in doing so, we can find a way to make our brand and our business relevant to them and try to make sure that the pillars that we build our brand on, our belief is one that's shared. The fourth point is about our point of view, our brand or our business's point of view on the world we inhabit, and really why anyone will give a damn about our point of view. So this is when we start to get beyond product features and benefits to say, look, what do we really care about? What is really important to us? And the last point is about our brand's attitude. So lots of businesses will have, brand guidelines, tone of voice, language, and that kind of thing. And of course, that's important. But we try to go a little bit deeper and define our stance or our attitude. And that will come out by exploring the things that we love, the things that we hate, the things that we change if we could, the things in our world that make us bristle, the aspects that we might kind of rub up against to create a little bit of tension. And so by unpacking those 6 aspects, the ambition, the big issue, understanding our customer, our competitor, our point of view, and our attitude, we start to produce the sort of the underpinning of the brand and its positioning and the potential activation. And that naturally forms the basis of the creative briefs that we work on. But those 6 points will really build the platform for the brand, and it's equally applicable for a particular campaign or a particular project, because it helps us get to quite a contained set of principles and ideas that then we can use to activate whatever needs to be brought to life and brought to market.
Yeah, those 6 points are a really interesting framework to work from. And on that topic of frameworks and further resources that might help our listeners learn more about challenger brand thinking, or might just pose different questions or different resources to help them with this terminology and with this new form of marketing, are there any that come to mind for you? I know you mentioned a couple of books earlier.
Yeah, I would say that on purpose, I think the Prosperity by Colin Mayer is that's the one to read about that. I mean, it's really interesting because it starts off by analysing economic models and why the old ways of thinking are not really relevant for the future. And it really supports that. It explains and supports that idea that that businesses should find profitable solutions to the problems of people and the planet, not profit from those problems. And that really enshrines that phrase and expands on that. And then Eating the Big Fish by Adam Morgan. That's the book that coined the phrase challenger brand thinking. And there's been developments and updates to certain aspects of that, also by Adam Morgan in a book called Overthrow and Overthrow 2 more recently, which I think was last year. And they explore the different challenger brand narratives. The traditional narrative in challenger thinking is that the sort of the David versus Goliath story, where the little guy takes on the big guy. But actually, there's much more. There's many, many more narratives than that. And Overthrow and Overthrow 2 are really worth looking at from that perspective.
That's been a really interesting episode, and there's plenty of resources to go away and learn more there. But before I let you go, can you let our listeners know where they can connect with you and learn more about Ape Creative?
Yeah, absolutely. Apecreative.com is where you can find more recent examples of our work and our thinking. And quite simply, my email address is paul@apecreative.com. So, and I'm sure you'll find me on LinkedIn too. But those are the quickest and easiest ways to get in touch. If anyone wants to chat more about any of this stuff, I could talk about it happily at length, and when we're allowed to, over a beer or a coffee.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much. This has been the Internet Marketing Podcast.